Morning. Thanks so much for joining us for Inside Utah Politics. I'm Glenn Mills. We get right to Senator Mike Lee. He joins us this morning. He's here to talk health care, new rules in the Senate, and much more. Senator, great to have you back on the show. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be here.
The health care bill, you were an outspoken critic of it. Why did you not like that plan? Why was it not the right way to go?
It didn't do enough to control costs. The cost of health care has gone way up in the last few years. We need to do something to bring those costs down. We can get there, but the AHCA, as it was introduced, didn't do enough.
What does it say about the plan that not only did it get no Democratic support, but really it was Republicans that put an end to it?
There's a risk anytime you try to take a big legislative package and negotiate it behind closed doors with only a few members being involved. And then you bring it out and you say everybody vote for it. That's a big risk. They took a risk and it turned out not to be a good risk.
Do you think the president was caught off guard somewhat at how difficult actually getting something like this through might be?
I think he might have been. I think he understands now that it's a process and that we can still get there, but it's going to take a little bit more work. I do think there were some people who were involved in the process, some from legislative leadership in Congress, others from the White House, who anticipated that it would just move right through and that it would pass instantaneously. It's normally not how it works.
So where do we go from here? What is a health care plan that you could get behind and support?
One way or another, it needs to deal with the regulations, the regulatory pressures that have been placed on the health insurance market that have caused premiums to go up so sharply, and deductibles and copays and so forth. Providing that regulatory relief will go a long way toward bringing Republican support on board for this bill. I think that can be done. It's just going to take a little bit more time.
Here in the state of Utah, the exchange has about 190,000 people that had signed up for health care. So the exchange has done somewhat well here in the state of Utah from the personal level. How do you make sure that those people, I'm sure you've met some of them, I have too, who are thankful that they have the coverage at an affordable cost. How do you make sure that's a smooth transition for them as well?
Well, first of all, when we make sure that free market forces are able to apply, when people are allowed to compete, when we increase competition, two very good things always happen, which is prices tend to go down and quality tends to go up. That's what Utahns want. They want better coverage and they also want more affordable coverage. One of the problems that we've had over the last few years is that a combination of state and federal regulations have interacted, especially some of the regulations imposed by the Affordable Care Act, in such a way that it has restricted competition. And that's been very good for a very small number of corporations. It's been very bad for a whole lot of people throughout Utah and across America.
Should protections for pre-existing conditions and children be able to stay on the plan until they're 26 years old? Do you like those elements of the Affordable Care Act?
President Trump has stated his position that he needs to keep those. It remains to be seen exactly what that will look like. But one way or another, he has stated that that's his position.
How important is it not only to get all the Republicans on board, but some Democratic support for this plan as well?
It's unlikely that we'll get Democratic support on board for anything that involves repealing Obamacare. I would very much like it if we had Democrat support, but right now we don't, and we're unlikely to as long as the focus continues to be on repeal. It's one of the reasons why another approach we might have taken at the outset would have been to repeal most or all of Obamacare and then start with an iterative step-by-step process, one that would gradually introduce free market reforms. So I think some Democrats could get on board with those.
Let's move to the Supreme Court nomination process. Of course, the Senate historic move in changing the rules from a super to a simple majority. Do you like that it has come to that? Are you okay with it?
I was deeply troubled when in November of 2013, the then Democratic majority in the Senate made the decision to go nuclear, to lower the threshold from 60 votes to close debate to 51 votes to close debate. I view that die as having been cast in November of 2013. Unfortunate moment perhaps for the Senate, but it is what it is.
You know as well as anyone else the pendulum will swing, so you could be on the backside of this at some point. How might you look at it from that perspective?
My number one concern with the filibuster is to make sure that we maintain what we call the legislative filibuster, to make sure that this doesn't metastasize onto the legislative calendar. In other words, it still takes 60 votes to close debate on nearly all legislation. I think we should keep that intact, and I've joined together with a bipartisan group of senators to make sure that we adhere to that principle, that we advocate on behalf of keeping it.
Judge Neil Gorsuch did get approved with the simple majority. Your thoughts on him and what you expect to see from him?
He's a fantastic jurist. He's been a great judge on the 10th Circuit. I've argued it in front of him in the 10th Circuit. He's going to do a fantastic job on the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm proud to have supported his nomination, and I think we can expect great things from our fellow Westerner who's now on the nation's highest court.
Tax reform, it's something you talked about long before President Trump was elected. What would you like to see, and will it move forward? It seems like discussion is now starting to get pushed off a bit as well.
President Trump is determined to make sure tax reform moves forward. We need that, and we need simplification of the tax code. We've got a tax code today that consists of nearly 100,000 pages of code. 100 years ago, it was less than 500 pages. I understand that societies evolve and that our society is much more complex than it was then, but it doesn't need to be quite as complex as it is. That complexity is a subsidy. It's a subsidy that supports a very small handful of tax attorneys, accountants, consultants, lobbyists. It's bad for basically everybody else. And people are harmed by our tax code in myriad ways, so we need tax code simplification. I do think we'll see some of that this year. There's still a lot of debate about what will be included in that. It's too soon to predict exactly what that's going to look like.
In the end, should someone such as myself with a communications degree be able to do my own taxes without it being so difficult, or is there still a need under what you would like to see for a professional accountant to do work?
Without question. You, like any other citizen, ought to be able to do your own taxes. You know, it was interesting. In a hearing a couple of years ago on the Joint Economic Committee in the Senate, I asked a person who has a PhD in the federal tax code, do you do your own taxes? And he said, no, absolutely not. Of course not. I asked why. He said, there is absolutely no way I would be confident that I would get the right answer. This from a man who has a PhD in the federal tax code.
Yeah, that's crazy.
This is very troubling. You know, Madison warned us in Federalist 62, it'll be of little avail to us if our laws are written by those of our own choosing, if the laws are so voluminous and complex that we can't understand what they mean or what our obligations as citizens might be.
Let's move on to national security and international relations. There's really some tense moments starting to occur with North Korea, Syria, Russia. Let's talk North Korea first. Your concerns there, now threatening to test missiles on a weekly basis.
Yeah, this is not a friendly regime. This is not a regime that means us well. And I think we've got to continue to put pressure on China to encourage North Korea to stop its aggressive behavior. We've got to monitor this very carefully. These guys are not to be ignored. This threat is not to be taken lightly.
What about Syria? Does Assad need to go?
Look, before we decide what, if anything, we're going to do there, what, if any, additional steps need to be taken there, I do want to hear a plan, there or anywhere else in the world, a plan for what, for example, a post-Assad Syria might look like, an explanation as to how U.S. national security, the safety of the American people, will be influenced by any action that might be taken there.
You were frustrated with the president in taking action without going to Congress. Do you still think that needs to be part of that plan as well?
Well, what I've said is that any time the president introduces the U.S. armed forces into hostilities, the president needs to have a justification, an explanation. The commander-in-chief is, of course, the president, and the president, as commander-in-chief, can take action where necessary to protect the United States, or its territories, or its armed forces from an imminent threat. It's important to have that explanation and that legal justification anytime he does anything. If additional steps are going to be taken beyond that, the president does need to come to Congress and seek a declaration of war or some other form of statutory authorization.
Real quick, your thoughts on your colleague in the House in the Utah delegation stepping aside. Representative Chase Fitz saying he will not run again in 2018.
Jason is a good friend. He and I have been close since we both served in Congress and since long before that. I've appreciated his service to the state.